everyone, my name's Anthony Gore, and today we're going to take Vue 3 for a test drive by using it to create a simple app. Now the purpose of this is to see if we can get a feel for working with Vue 3. Maybe we can see where it's different, where it's the same as Vue 2. And I also want to have some discussion about why certain things have been added or changed in the Vue 3 API, so that we can understand the rationale of it a little bit better. So obviously there are lots of new features in Vue 3. This is the first major version in several years. So I won't be able to cover everything here, of course, but I'm going to try and cover some of the main features that you've probably heard about, like fragments, teleport, composition API, but also some of the more obscure but still important changes and additions that we will come across. So just quickly, a few things about me before we get started. So I'm the creator of Vue.js Developers. This is a resource I made to help developers improve their skill and knowledge of Vue beyond what's in the docs. I also blog and teach online courses. You can find a lot of my stuff on Vuejsdevelopers.com. I'm an author as well, so I've got a book out called Full Stack Vue 2 and Laravel 5. Given the topic of this talk, I probably need to update that one soon. And I'm also happy to be a Vue community partner. All right, let's get started. So over the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to show you how to build a reusable modal window feature. We're going to use Vue 3 to do that. So let's just take a quick look at the final thing. Let me just play that one more time in case you missed it. So as you can see, it's nothing too impressive, but this just basic app is something that is going to allow us to showcase a number of Vue 3's features, which is the whole point of this. So to get us up and running quickly, let's use Vue CLI version 4.5 to create a new Vue project. And so we'll just name that Vue 3 Experiment. Now note that the recent version 4.5 of Vue CLI, that gives us the option to select either Vue 2 or Vue 3. So if you're using an older version of Vue CLI, you can still use Vue 3, you just need to manually change the Vue dependency, which you can do with npm. Now if you've used Vue CLI before, obviously you'll know that we get a number of boilerplate files. So what we want to do first is go to the terminal and we'll change into the Vue CLI project directory, and then the next two commands I've got there, these are going to clear the contents of the entry file and the main component file so that we can create our Vue 3 app from scratch. So now opening the entry file, main.js, and this is where we're going to declare our new Vue 3 app. And straight off the bat, you can see that the way that we do this has changed significantly from Vue 2. So rather than using a Vue constructor and the new operator, what we now do is we import the create app function. We then call this function and we pass in an app configuration object, and we can also optionally assign the created app to a variable. We then call the mount method on the app and pass it a CSS selector, and this indicates our mount element. This is very similar to how we did it in Vue 2. So why the change from using the Vue constructor to this new create app function? Well, the Vue constructor pattern, if you use that, any global configuration that you add, for example, if you want to add plugins, mix-ins, prototype properties, and so on, these will all permanently mutate global state. So for example, if we were to add a mix-in to the Vue 2 constructor, then this mix-in is going to be added to all the app instances that we create from this constructor, whether we like it or not. And this can often be a problem in things like unit testing, because it makes it really tricky to ensure that each test is going to be isolated from the last. So the new API, that doesn't get polluted by any global configuration because the global configuration will be added to the app instance. All right, so a modal window, obviously, can be in one of two states, either opened or closed. So what we're going to do is we're going to manage this state by adding a Boolean data property modal open. We're going to give that an initial value of false. Now, if we were to use Vue 2 syntax for this, what we could do is just create a data property on our app instance and assign an object where our modal open property would be declared. But you can't do it this way anymore in Vue 3. So now the data config property, it needs to be assigned a factory function, and that's going to return the state object. So you're probably familiar with this pattern anyway because you always had to do this for Vue components, but now it's been enforced for the Vue app instance as well. Now I think it does seem simpler to use an object rather than a factory function, but I guess it's just not very beginner friendly to have two different ways of declaring component data. I think it's better for beginners if we avoid the mental load of having to remember and understand the difference between the doing it the object way and the function way. All right, so the best practice for Vue projects, as you'll probably know from Vue 2, is to put all the root level functionality into a root component rather than having it in the root instance. So the typical way that you'll do this is to create a component called app, for example. Now if this were a Vue 2 project, what we'd then do is we'd use a render function to render that component so that we could avoid declaring that component in our index.html file, which in turn avoids us having to use the template compiler in our Vue build. Well, in Vue 3, there's a much simpler way to do this now. So you can actually just pass your root component directly to the create app method, and that's going to automatically make it a root component. So this means you don't need to mess with a render function. You don't need any boilerplate config in your root instance at all. So now that we've done that, what we can do is just simplify this syntax and chain the mount method straight onto the create app method. And I think this is a very elegant way to set up a Vue instance. All right, so coming over to our root component now, app.vue. So what I've done here is I've just moved all that logic that I previously added to the root instance into the root component now. So still in our root component, what we're going to do is add a button and a click handling method to toggle the modal open state. So this is exactly how we'd do it in Vue 2 as well. I just wanted to mention this so that the next few steps make sense. So back in the terminal now, what we want to do is create our modal by adding a new component file, which we'll call modal.vue. And for now, we're just going to provide a minimal template for this component, including a slot for content. We'll add more to this in a moment. Coming back to the root component, what we'll do now is declare our modal component here in the template. And what we're going to do is conditionally render this component based on the value of modal open. So we'll also insert a paragraph of text into the slot so we've got some content there. Now, do you notice anything odd about this component's template compared to how you'd do it in Vue 2? Well, in case you didn't pick it up, there's two root elements in this template. So in Vue 3, thanks to this feature called fragments, it's no longer compulsory to have a single root element in a template like it was in Vue 2. Right, so focusing now on the script section of this root component. So all the logic here is really for one thing, and that's to manage the state of this modal. So in order to make this code reusable in other parts of this app, or even if we wanted to use our modal in a different project, what we'd want to do is try and abstract all that logic by putting it into a separate file that could be reused. So to do this, what we can do is refactor the component to use the composition API, which is obviously another major feature of Vue 3. So let's go through the steps of, this is what it looks like once the refactor is complete. I'll just take you through the steps of how this actually works now. So components using the composition API, they define their functionality in this setup method. And using this method means that we don't need the data config, we don't need the methods config or any other options really. Now, since this is just a refactor, so we're still going to have the same functionality as before. It's just that we've changed how we create it. So firstly, our data property modal open. So one way that you can create reactive variables if you're using the composition API is to use this ref API method. Now the toggle modal state method, this is just a plain JavaScript function. Just note though that to change the value of modal open, we need to change a subproperty value. Now, that's because reactive variables created using ref, they are wrapped in objects in order to retain their reactivity as they're passed around. Finally, we'll return modal open and toggle modal state from this setup method. And what that does is that makes them accessible to the template when it's rendered. Alright, so the next step to make the code reusable is to move all that functionality into a separate JavaScript module. So let's go ahead and create a module file which we'll call useModalState.js. Now what I've done is moved all the contents of the setup function and its dependencies into this module file. So going back to app.vue, what we want to do now is we're going to import this useModalState module that we just created. Then what we want to do is we still want to have a setup method in our component, but we're going to grab the state and the method from that module file that we just created, and we can make them available to our root component template. Sorry, I didn't highlight the code before, so that's where we import useModalState, and then that's where we grab those variables and make them available to our root component template. So with all that done, we've successfully abstracted the functionality for managing the modal state into a module file, and that means that this could be reused anywhere else in the app or even in another project. Alright, so if we were to do the same thing in Vue 2, if we wanted to make this particular feature reusable, what we would have done is used mixins. Now we can still use mixins in Vue 3, but in my opinion at least, I think these are essentially obsolete now because of the composition API. So let's just say that we did create a mixin instead of using the composition API. Then what we'd have to do is move all that relevant functionality into a separate module file. The only difference is that we just import it here and assign it to our component using the mixins property here. Now one reason that mixins aren't a great way to reuse code is just look at this component, and it's not really that easy to link the render context to the component definition. So what I mean is using the variables modal state and modal open in the template, we don't see these in the component definition because they've been abstracted now into the mixin. Now in a simple component like this, that doesn't seem so bad. I mean, it's fairly easy to figure that out. But just imagine that we had several mix-ins in this component, and let's also say that the component was much bigger. Let's say it was 50 or more lines. Suddenly, it would become quite challenging to keep track of what variable comes from what mix-in, and that makes it harder to reason about the component and also harder to maintain. Compare that to the composition API, and when we use the composition API and the setup function, we can easily see where our features are coming from, and we have the flexibility of JavaScript modules, which that means we can rename our imports to whatever we want, and this just makes it a lot easier to track any reusable features as dependencies. All right, so let's talk about another topic now, and we'll take a look at this new feature of Vue 3 called Teleport. So if you've ever created a modal window feature using Vue before, or not even using Vue, just in any kind of HTML and JavaScript project, you'll know that it's common to position your modal just above the closing body tag in the document. Now the reason that you'd want to do that is because modals usually have a page covering background. So if you see the screenshot there of where the modal is open, we've created a page covering background. Now, in order to implement a page covering background with CSS, you don't want to have to deal with parent element positioning and z-index stacking context and all this sort of stuff to try and get the page covering background working. So the simplest solution is just to put the modal at the very bottom of the DOM, and that makes it a lot easier to create the CSS to do that. However, this is not very compatible with Vue because Vue assumes that the UI is going to be built as a single tree of components. So in order to allow a segment of the tree to be moved elsewhere in the DOM, this new teleport component has been added to Vue 3. So let's see how we use it. So first what we'd want to do is add an element to our page where we want our modal content to be moved to. So for example, in our index.html file, what we'll do is place a div with an ID modal wrapper, and we're going to put that adjacent to Vue's mounting element. So in Vue 2, this new element we're creating, this would be inaccessible from the Vue instance because it falls outside of the Vue template. So back in app.vue, what we're going to do here is we're going to wrap the modal content in this new global teleport component. And we also need to specify a to attribute, which is going to be assigned the query selector identifying the target element of where we want to move it, which in this case is modal-wrapper. Now, any content within the teleport is going to be rendered in the target element. However, it still is going to function like it was in the original position in the hierarchy, so you can still pass props to it, receive events from it, and so on. Okay, so once you open the modal, once the app's actually running and you open the modal and then you inspect the state of the DOM, you'll see that the modal is now positioned inside this modal wrapper element, which is of course adjacent to the Vue mounting element. So that's something that wouldn't be possible to do in Vue 2, at least not without a plugin. All right, so let's now take a look at this modal component file. And what we want to do is add a button allowing the modal to be closed. So to do this, we're going to add a button element, and we'll put a click handler on it, and this one's going to emit an event close. So So in our root app component, we would then capture this close event, and we'd use it to trigger the toggle modal state method, and that's going to toggle the value of modal open, logically making it false, and therefore causing the window to close. Now, so far this feature is identical to how you'd do it in Vue 2. What's different in Vue 3 though is it's now recommended that you explicitly state a component's events using this new emit component option. So it's very much like props, where you can simply create an array of strings to name each event that the component is going to emit. Now it's not compulsory to do this, so why would you bother? Well, imagine opening the file of a component that someone else has written, and it's got the props listed, and it's got the events explicitly declared like this. Now immediately you're going to understand the interface of this component. In other words, what is this component meant to send and receive? So in other words, it's going to provide self-documenting code. In addition to that though, just like with props, what you can do is you can make emits an object, and you can then, for each of your events, you can validate them. So I couldn't find a reason to do it in this app example, but that's something you can do as well. Now again, to make our modal reusable, we've used a slot for the content. And in the app component, we've put a paragraph tag in the slot. That's the content that we want to use. Now looking back in our modal component, let's just say that we wanted to style the paragraph content that's been put into the slot. So obviously we'd use a style tag and add some CSS. And it's always a good practice to use the scoped attribute in your style blocks, because what that does is it ensures that any CSS rules that we add, they don't have any unintended effects on other content in the page. So if we wanted to style the paragraph tag, what we might do is make a rule for paragraphs, and we can, let's just say we want to make the text italic. We could put a font style there like that. Now, if we were to do it exactly this way, you'd find that it doesn't work. And the issue is that scoped styling is determined at compile time when the slot content is still belongs to the parent. So the solution to doing this in Vue 3 is there's a new pseudo selector that we can use in our CSS, which is vSlotted. And what this does is it's specifically designed to allow you to target slot content for CSS styling. So using the vSlotted pseudo selector, it's going to apply the italic effect to the paragraph content in the slot. By the way, Vue 3 also includes some other new scope styling selectors. So you've got vDeep and vGlobal as well. Alright, so that covers all the features of Vue 3 that I've got time to test drive today. So there's obviously still quite a few that I didn't get to cover, but I'm sure some of the other talks today are going to cover those features. And of course you can look up the features in the Vue 3 docs. Anyway, if you'd like to get the slides or the demo project that I was working with today, you can go ahead and visit this page, https:/VJS developers.com/VG2020. In other words, Vue Global 2020. And I'm going to put the links for that stuff there. Finally, if you'd like to learn Vue 3 in a video course, then you might want to check out these two courses that are up on Vue.js So these are my two introductory Vue courses: Build Your First Vue App and Build a Single Page App with Vue Router and Vue CLI. So I've just finished updating both of these to Vue 3, so you can check those out later if you're interested. So I'll put the links to those on that same page, so vuejsdevelopers.com/VG2020. All right, with that, I'll wrap up my talk. So thanks for watching it, and please enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye for now.